Okay, so again, welcome everybody and thank you for your patience. We're actually 24 participants at the moment, so I think that's amazing. On behalf of the Tropical Restoration Network, we've been so lucky that Johannes has agreed to do this webinar. The Tropical Restoration Network, just to let you know a little bit, well, what we do is we work on seagrass and mangrove restoration and trying to get everybody that works on it and wants to learn about it in the Caribbean, Eastern Tropical Pacific, and Gulf of Mexico region to sort of get a chance to learn from each other and be in touch or get in touch with everybody. And so we got some funding back in 2022 at the University of Costa Rica to be able to sort of develop the network a bit more. And so we've done a workshop that we did here in Costa Rica, and we had some mangrove restoration sites that we visited. And then we were able to do a course, an international course on mangrove restoration as well. That was this year. And then we do a lot of these like workshops, like the webinars as well. And so we have several of them on our socials that you can also go and have a look at whenever you want and follow us, whether it's our socials or the link that Jessica's going to put for the mailing list, so you can get it directly to your email for any upcoming events or webinars or workshops that we're doing. So for instance, next year we're planning on doing a seagrass restoration one in Bonaire. So if you could just wait so that we could give you a bit more information as soon as we have it, that would be great. So today, like I mentioned, Johannes Krause has agreed kindly to give this webinar for us. Johannes is a coastal biogeochemist and seascape ecologist. He got his bachelor's in geoecology from the University of, I hope I'm saying this correctly, Tübingen in Germany, sort of, sorry. His master's in marine system science from the University of Glasgow in Scotland. He got a PhD at Drexel University. And then he did a postdoc at FIU, Florida International University in the US, where he's actually currently an assistant research professor. He's working on the effects of coastal environmental change on ecosystem services delivered by seagrasses. He actually studies spatio-temporal dynamics of seagrasses, salt marshes, and mangroves using remote sensing techniques, field-based sampling, and predictive modeling. His methodological approach is grounded in a range of disciplines, including environmental chemistry, sedimentology, geospatial analysis, and time series analysis. And with his research, he aims to uncover how anthropogenic impacts and natural variability shape coastal processes in biogeochemical cycles. So it really is an honor for us to be able to have this webinar, and I pass it over to you, Johannes. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. Let me quickly share my presentation with you. And thanks everyone for attending. I saw some familiar names as well, specifically some of the folks who helped work on the project that I'm going to talk about mostly today. So it's great to see everyone here. All right, just making sure I get the presentation up and you all can see it. Looking good so far. So yeah, my presentation today is titled "Not All Seagrasses Are the Same," and it's on the variability in Caribbean seagrass systems and their potential for blue carbon. So I wanted to start off by reminding ourselves of one of the most critical drivers of environmental change today. And we are probably all familiar with this, the Keeling curve, the measurements of CO2 from Mauna Loa in Hawaii. This is a really stark visual, I think, and often cited as the first evidence of rapidly increasing CO2 concentrations in the Earth's atmosphere. Now, to put this into a historical context, we can add the reconstructed data in addition to the directly measured one and show the increase since the invention of the steam engine and the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. And going back even further in time, this graph starts about 2000 years after the invention of agriculture. So this is to show that the current atmospheric CO2 levels are unprecedented in times of our current human societal organization. Now, even expanding a little back, 800,000 years to be precise, this is way past the origins of Homo sapiens. And we see that CO2 varied considerably between periods of glaciations and warm periods, but even stretching back 800,000 years, there's never been as much CO2 in the atmosphere as today. And of course, the impact of elevated CO2 in our Earth system becomes more and more clear. So it has been linked to rising temperatures, melting ice caps, resulting sea level rise, more intense droughts, heat waves, flooding, and wildfires, and of course also tropical cyclone activity. So it is clear that the conditions in our planet right now are rapidly changing, and it's affecting both the natural environment as well as our human civilization. Now, carbon is always cycling through the atmosphere, hydrosphere, and geosphere, and human activity is affecting the balance of those carbon cycles. This is chiefly through the extraction and burning of fossil fuels. But to understand how this carbon cycle is changing and the different compartments of this carbon cycle are changing, climate scientists are measuring and modeling all of these aspects and all of these arrows that you can see in this figure over here. But while it's relatively easy to measure human-made CO2 emissions, the flow of carbon through the land and ocean remains one of the least understood parts of climate science. So while human emissions are increasingly simple to measure, the sheer number and complexity of processes that we have to take into account in the natural world mean that there are important gaps in our understanding. And I think most of us are probably most interested in this part of the carbon cycle. And this is what I'm going to talk about today, which is the coastal part where organisms do photosynthesis, take up CO2 and produce biomass. And a part of that biomass is buried in sediments. So that's what I'm going to focus on today, this part in the red box. Now, the general idea is that coastal vegetated ecosystems, such as mangroves and tidal marshes, and also seagrasses, are taking up more carbon via photosynthesis than they lose from respiration. And a part of that generated organic matter is then exported, imported, but also buried in the soils. And because of these systems being underwater for part of the time, for seagrasses most of the time, they have waterlogged soils. And so little of that organic matter that is buried is then respired and returned to the atmosphere. Most of it actually stays as it is in the soils. And so the resulting soil carbon stocks can be really large, specifically compared to terrestrial systems, and especially for mangroves. So on the left side over there is a graph from classic paper by Forkran and others from 2012, where it was shown with a global data set that seagrasses can be globally significant carbon stores, especially in the sediments. But what you can also see when you look at that figure is all these little dots on the seagrass bar over there. And so this represents the variability in data. So this is to show that even though seagrasses can store as much carbon as some oceanic mangroves, which already is many times more than temperate or boreal forests on a per area basis, it can also be very little. So it's just a huge variability in seagrass carbon. And yeah, this seagrass compartment. And perhaps this variability is part of why there have not been many seagrass blue carbon projects implemented as of today. I show you a graphic over here from Dan Fries and others from 2022, which shows blue carbon projects, so restoration, protection projects that are chiefly designed for the purpose of maximizing blue carbon and financed through carbon. So all the green circles, that's mangrove projects. And for mangroves, we much better understand the variability in carbon stores. We much better understand where they are. We have good maps. And so it is probably also easier to implement those projects at this point. Whereas for seagrass, in the first place, we have a relatively little idea of the global extent. where they actually are located, and then this huge variability in carbon stores is really hindering the implementation of blue carbon projects in seagrasses. You can see a few small blue circles there on the map. I think the first project that actually comes online with carbon credits as the Chesapeake Bay one this year. I'm not sure if it's live as of now, this moment, but this year it's supposed to start. So seagrasses are lagging behind here in comparison to other blue carbon systems. But since they have been recognized as good carbon stores, there has been a lot of research into the drivers of this organic carbon in the systems. So this is a little bit of a figure by Mazarasa and others that showed just the different types of environmental drivers that determine how much organic carbon is stored in seagrass meadows. And they point to differences in the species. For example, they say that larger species are associated with larger carbon stocks compared to smaller species. They mentioned the canopy complexity, the landscape of seagrasses, so how patchy it is, but also trophic interactions. And these are just a few of the drivers that they point to through a literature survey that they did. More recently, Hillary Kennedy and others published a study using a global seagrass database of sediment cores. And they found that seagrass traits can be really important in predicting how much carbon is stored in soils associated with seagrass meadows. So for example, they found that the number of leaves per shoot, below ground biomass, the lifespan of leaves, and lignin content, all of these things can positively impact carbon in seagrass soils. But they also found that the geomorphology of the coastal areas where the seagrasses grow play a role. So it's a little bit of both. It's the environment and it's the seagrass traits themselves. Most recently, I've been working with the Blue Carbon Initiative to further constrain global seagrass blue carbon estimates and look at the drivers of carbon stocks. And we built a global database doing a literature survey, ended up with over 2,200 sediment cores that we then analyzed for the drivers of blue carbon. And what we found was that not all of the seagrasses are associated with the same magnitude of carbon stocks. So we categorized the seagrass genera into different functional groups based on their life history. For example, the persistent species, such as Thalassia, Posidonia, the ones that are growing year after year, persisting throughout seasons in the same place, have typically large rhizomes and large leaves and so on. They are associated with larger carbon stocks globally compared to ephemeral species that might pop up here and there, not persist in a particular place over time, might be characterized more as colonizing. And those are associated with smaller carbon stocks globally. We also looked at the different marine ecoregions and compared where there are highest seagrass carbon stocks. And I would like to point to the tropical Atlantic, which is one of the regions with the highest seagrass carbon stocks. There are other regions that have very high stocks with very little samples, so a little bit of more work is needed, I guess, by the global seagrass community to fill in some of the gaps here. But I think we get a pretty good picture overall. And this highlights that the Caribbean specifically is probably a really good place for seagrass blue carbon. Now, that's just the broad introduction over here. Today, I would like to talk about a project that aimed specifically at the Caribbean for seagrass blue carbon, and it's the Caribbean Carbon Accounting in Seagrass, or CARICAS project. So this is a project that was funded by the Nature Conservancy. And the idea of this project was twofold. One, we wanted to assess the variability and the environmental drivers of seagrass carbon stocks across the greater Caribbean region. And then second, we wanted to create a map of carbon stocks in the Caribbean. And this project just wrapped up this summer. And I'm going to present some of the findings that we had, specifically for the first objective. So variability of carbon stocks and the environmental controls. So for this project, we developed a standardized methodology to survey seagrass meadows and build a database that we could then analyze and see what drives seagrass carbon. And the idea was that we wanted to characterize different seagrass meadows across the Caribbean, find partners, build a network of people who are interested in these questions, and then have each partner survey at least 2 seagrass meadows and measure these variables that I list over here. On the right side, you see an illustration of our study design. So at each site, we would have a central point where we took sediment core, a deep sediment core, 1 meter, ideally. That helps us characterize soil organic carbon storage. And then there were 16 quadrats around that core that were randomly distributed. And in these quadrats, we would measure things like seagrass abundance, species composition, also the abundance of other benthic organisms like algae and corals, sponges, and so on. Then at half of those quadrats, 8 of them, we would take biomass cores to get above and below ground biomass and the seagrass shoot densities. And at each site, we would collect some seagrass material of each species to analyze for nutrient content, carbon content, and stable isotope ratios. And then this core that I mentioned, the 1 meter deep core in the middle of the survey, that one we would analyze each subsection. So we would like subsample the core and analyze that also for carbon, both organic, inorganic, and then nutrients and stable isotopes. So this is a really rich data set that would be gathered from this. To perform this project, we reached out to as many organizations throughout the region as possible. And that would be including NGOs, universities, government institutions. And all in all, a network came together with 27 partner organizations who took part in the project and sampled at least 2 of those seagrass meadows in their area. We tried to do that in a way that each partner would decide what meadow to sample to support their interest or science needs or management needs. And then the second meadow we would try to decide on together so that the data set is balanced in the different environmental drivers that we thought might be important. But so on the map over here in pink, you can see all the partner sites. And all in all, we sampled 21 countries, had 75 sediment cores, 591 biomass cores, and then the sediment cores were subsampled to almost 1,500 distinct subsamples. And then all these quadrats with seagrass cover, composition, substrate type, and all of this information. They're all georeferenced and are going to be available in repositories such as OBIS relatively soon, end of this year, I think. So we hope that this is going to be a good resource for everyone interested in seagrass research to use and do science or analysis or whatever with. Here are the project partners. Too many to mention all of them, but I just would like to say that I'm super thankful for everyone put in this work and was motivated to make this happen. It's been a really, really cool experience to see so many different organizations, people from different walks of life being interested in Caribbean seagrass and trying to make something like this happen. And yeah, thank you, especially a few of those who are right now here online in the seminar that I saw. Thank you very much. Now let's jump into the findings. So first I wanted to start with the seagrass biomass. So seagrasses, they do store organic carbon in the biomass. Most of it is in the soils though, but depending on the species, there can be quite significant carbon also in the biomass. And maybe not surprising, Thalassia testudium was associated with the largest above and below ground biomass. The other native seagrasses in the region, Syringodium filiforme and Halodoliraidii, had respectively lower above and below ground biomass. Now, all of the species that we sampled had larger biomass stores below ground compared to above ground, which might be important. Also, recognize that this graph is on a log scale, so the differences are actually quite large. Just for display purposes, put them on a log scale here. Now, the seagrass on the very right, Halophilus stipulaceae, is an invasive in the Caribbean. And so it does not have a distribution throughout the entire region yet. We mainly encountered it in the southern and in the eastern Caribbean. But while it had the lowest above ground biomass overall, it can have significant below ground biomass. And that might be pretty important because the seagrass is taking over in some regions from native seagrasses. And there's a question as to how that might affect carbon stores. And if there have been carbon stocks built up by native seagrasses over time, and these seagrasses are lost, it's a question whether the invasive seagrass might help cap and retain those stores that are already there. Maybe it might enhance it, or maybe it is associated with lower carbon stores. So this is a question I think that will have to be researched a little bit more in the future, in the years to come. Just an update in that regard is that just a couple of months ago, it has been recorded in Florida now for the first time. So it reached US waters. Some of my colleagues at FIU just put out a paper. We just found it here, right in, I think, a couple of kilometers from where I am right now in a marina. Likely has been brought here from boats coming from other parts of the Caribbean. So it is something we have to wrestle with. And in this project, we did have quite some sites that had this invasive seagrass. Now jumping to the soil organic carbon stocks. So this is the larger part of organic carbon stocks in seagrass systems, generally speaking. And this graph is to show you the huge variability that we have even in this region. So each of those bars is one sediment core. And when we compare different sites, we usually use a specific reference depth to count all the carbon just to say 30 centimeters and then compare between sites of 50 centimeters or 100. And so these are shown over here with the different shades. The black stripes on the bars, that's up to 30 centimeters. Then without stripes is up to 50 centimeters. And not all cores reached a meter depth, but those that did are with the white shades. And there's really no clear pattern in the amount of carbon stored between different countries that did the surveys. But we did do analysis to see what are actually driving those huge differences that we see. And that's what I'm going to talk about in the coming slides. So from what I showed you in the beginning is that one could expect that different species of seagrass are associated with different amounts of carbon stored in the soil. And so we characterized each seagrass meadow in our project by the dominant species. So the seagrass species that had the highest average cover on the site was the dominant one. And then we compared the carbon stocks. So there's a tendency for higher organic carbon stocks in Thalassia meadows compared to Syringodium and Halophila meadows. But you can also see this huge variability in Thalassia organic carbon stocks. So whilst most of the highest organic carbon stocks were in Thalassia meadows, there can also be very, very little carbon in Thalassia meadows as well. So it's not per se that if you find this persistent seagrass species in the Caribbean, that it's automatically associated with high carbon stocks. And the flip side is also true. Among the highest average stocks, where we found surprisingly in Halodontidae meadows. Now, we only had 3 seagrass meadows that were halodolid dominated. So it's a pretty small sample size. And 2 of them were mixed with Thalassia. So there's that. But they were also associated with really high soil organic carbon stocks. So the dominant species is not necessarily a good predictor of soil organic carbon stocks in the Caribbean. Now, looking at biomass, um, maybe also surprisingly, we also found that neither the below ground nor the above ground biomass of seagrasses was a good predictor of organic carbon stocks. So conceptually, the idea is if you have seagrass below ground biomass that kind of contributes directly organic matter into the sediment, and if roots and rhizomes die, they just stay there and they make up soil organic carbon. And above ground biomass, the idea is it helps trap sediment particles, maybe trap organic matter that comes into the meadow, or also get buried partially and so on. So generally speaking, one would expect that seagrass biomass positively influences the soil organic carbon stocks, but we did not find that throughout the Caribbean. However, we did find that the canopy height of seagrasses was a good predictor of soil organic carbon. So that perhaps reflects overall productivity. More productive meadows have a higher canopy height. And maybe importantly, this is independent of the seagrass species. So a relatively high canopy of Syringodium is not as necessarily associated with a very high above ground biomass, whereas Thalassia is because it just has broader leaves and more material. So canopy height is a little bit different from above ground biomass in that regard. And it seemed to be an important predictor across the Caribbean. Now looking into the sediments, I show you over here a graph of organic carbon stocks on the Y and then sediment type on the X-axis. This is a qualitative measure. It's a rapid field assessment that we do where a low number is fine sediment. One would be mud, two is a sandy mud, three is a muddy sand, and four is sand. And then it gets coarser the higher the number. And so what we found is that high organic carbon stocks are in fine sediment. The idea here is that fine sediment better retains organic carbon once it's there, because the organic matter can be absorbed to the sediment particle surfaces, and it's not that easy to break it down for microbial organisms. So this is something that has been described in other regions of the world, that generally fine sediments retain organic carbon a little bit better than coarse ones. It's also true that in low energy environments, you would deposit more fine sediments. So seagrasses that grow in environments that don't have strong currents and a lot of hydrodynamic energy, that's where you have the fine sediments, but that's also where you have higher organic carbon stocks. On the flip side of that, coarse sediments make it easier for oxygen to penetrate, and then the microbial organisms love oxygen. It's provides them with more energy to break down organic matter, and so that contributes to fewer or like lower organic carbon stocks in coarse sediment environments. Now, one interesting thing that we found is that in some of the sediment cores throughout the region, we would have these very steep increases in organic matter at depth in the core, say like half a meter deep or a meter deep. That would be very high organic material. And this is where our stable isotope analysis comes in. Because by looking at the carbon stable isotope signatures of the organic matter in these cores, we can estimate the sources of organic matter. And that is because different primary producers can produce different stable isotope ratios in the carbon that they fix through photosynthesis. And without going into too much detail, in this graph on the left over here, there are vertical lines at the stable isotope ratio of minus 27 or so. That is indicative of mangrove organic matter. We would expect mangrove organic matter to have a stable isotope ratio of minus 27, whereas seagrass is more around minus 10 or so. And the purple lines in these graphs over here are the stable isotope ratio. The green lines are the organic carbon content. What you can see is that these very high organic carbon parts of the cores, they are most likely mangrove matter. And this has been confirmed by additional analysis, looking at the structure and so on. So what we are dealing here with is mangrove peat that is buried in seagrass meadows. And this was actually quite common. So out of those 75 cores or so in our data set, we had about 8 or 9 where the seagrasses are growing on ancient mangrove peat. And when I say ancient, talking about 2,000 to 5,000 years old. So we were doing 14C dating on those organic matter samples. And in different places, they had different ages, but that's around it. So what we're looking at here is a mangrove habitat that with sea level rise at some point was replaced with seagrass habitat. But interestingly, those mangrove peats that were deposited, they're still there, and the seagrasses are capping them off. And throughout the data set, if we look at all the cores in the seagrass meadows that had really, really high soil organic carbon, those are typically associated with buried mangrove peat. So this seems to be pretty important throughout Caribbean seagrasses. In areas where there might have been mangroves growing before, there's a good chance that these remnant peats are still contributing to the carbon stocks of seagrasses. Now, we also did a different measure. We looked at the seascape configuration. So we calculated the distance of each of our sediment cores to the nearest mangrove forest and also to the nearest coral reef, and also calculated the area of mangrove or reef within a certain radius from the sediment cores. And what we found is that, generally speaking, now not related to the mangrove peat, just generally speaking, seagrass meadows that are closer to mangroves and those that have a lot of mangrove area within a kilometer buffer or so have higher organic carbon stocks. So it is very likely that mangrove organic carbon is supplementing seagrass carbon stocks even today. It doesn't have to be an ancient remnant peat or so, but still this organic matter exchange that you have between different coastal ecosystems is likely helping seagrasses store more carbon. So we are still continuing stable isotope analysis on this in the future. So we're looking at surface sediments and the stable carbon isotopic signature. And this will help us identify whether indeed there's mangrove material now being buried currently in those seagrasses or not. So this is yet to come. We put all of those different variables that we had, and some of them that I just talked about, into different types of predictive models to see how much of this variability that we saw in carbon stocks can be explained. And we use different approaches here, a little bit of machine learning, some more simple linear regression kind of things. And we looked at how important the different variables were. So what we found is that all of our different modeling approaches, they all kind of converged on the same points. What I just showed you before, all of the models said the most important predictors for organic carbon in seagrass meadows in the Caribbean are mangrove habitats nearby, the seagrass canopy, and then sediment size. So fine sediments, high seagrass canopy, and a lot of mangrove habitat nearby. Those by themselves, those are the most important predictors of high organic carbon stocks. So what can we learn from that? Since those three parts are the main drivers throughout the Caribbean, we can think of it a little bit in this type of conceptual model. It seems that there are three main parts of the seagrass blue carbon equation in the Caribbean. One is the organic carbon burial. So how much is deposited, how much is coming in. And here, seagrass biomass is important, the persistence of seagrasses is important, and the amount of organic carbon that is deposited is important. But what we found with our research here is that this is not the only part important is just adding to the precondition of the seagrass meadow. So what has been the ecological history of the site? Are there legacy carbon stocks there? Has there been a lot of disturbance history, which could negatively impact carbon stocks? And then, of course, as a third part, we have the organic carbon loss, so remineralization of organic matter. And here, things like erosion, high hydrodynamic energy, those increase the organic carbon loss and thereby decrease the stocks. But fine sediment content is preventing some of that remineralization, and so is positively influencing the carbon stocks. Now, if I were to take home five messages or 5 points from all of this from this project, first, I think it is important to mention that there are so many good reasons to restore or protect seagrasses, and blue carbon is only one of them. Now, fisheries production, cultural meaning, also protection of shorelines, and so on. Many, many good reasons. But if we focus on blue carbon, then the type of meadow that we're looking at really matters. And I think that we can use relatively simple protocols to look at these meadows and measure the important things. We found through this work in this network that it's not really necessary to have a lot of funds or a lot of training to do this work. We are working with relatively simple methods over here. And overall, if I would have to make a decision or management call as to which seagrass meadows preferably to work on for blue carbon, I think that the energy and nutrient environment are really important, and then really this connectivity to other coastal habitats. I think our work shows that this connection between seagrasses and mangroves, specifically in the Caribbean, is really important. And so my last point, I think it is really important to think about these coastal ecosystems holistically. And ideally, if we can do any conservation, nature conservation, thinking of them always separately and in their boxes as a seagrass and a seagrass, and mangrove people think about mangroves, might not really get us where we want to be in the end. And we should think of the continuum of coastal vegetated ecosystems. With that, I would like to thank you. And of course, again, thank all of the project partners for all the work in the field and the lab, Nature Conservancy for funding the project. And I want to point out that we developed this beautiful field and laboratory guide that has all the protocols for all the methods that lead to these data that I presented. And that's available on our website. It's a great document. We have it in English as well as in Spanish. It's a good translation. So it's on seagrass.fru.edu/caricas HTM. You're not going to get there without the HTM. For some reason, it's a terrible link. If you would like to follow up with anything, please just send me an email, jkrause@fru.edu. With that, I would like to take questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Johannes. Does anybody have any questions? Because I don't think I saw any in the chat. Did you, Jessica?
No, I haven't seen any yet, but I actually have a question that I can lead off with, and maybe that will inspire someone else to ask a question. Do you know of any connection or anyone who's done any research into the connection between repeated sargassum landings and the ability of seagrass to store carbon, like assuming that the seagrass survives?
Yeah, excellent question. Of course, this is a hot topic in some areas. We did not have any time component in our study, so we didn't really have the ability to look at it with and without, or like over time with sargassum come by and so on. But our colleagues at UNAM, Medina are working on these questions, and Yucatan. I know that. Yeah, it's a fascinating question because it's a lot of organic matter that's being imported into a system, but it's also in many cases killing off the primary producer. So tricky one.
Well, I have a question. Nobody else does. Because I know that here in Costa Rica, we've had a lot of issue with excessive grazing from sea turtles, which leads to a much shorter canopy. And we have a very, very decimated seagrass population at some of our sites and seagrass loss. And I'm not sure from the assessment or the analysis that you were doing. I know that you were looking at the length of the canopy, but other than that, did you directly link it to any pressures that might be leading to that diminishment potentially in the length of the seagrasses?
Yeah. So we did not measure herbivory directly. It was more anecdotal in our data set, so we didn't analyze for it. There was another region-wide project that was looking specifically at the effects of herbivory with the Thalassia Experimental Network that you were part of, I think, as well. No? And yeah, I think it is still a relatively open question as to how herbivory directly affects carbon stocks, because I think in terms of legacy carbon, things that are already sequestered and already in place, there might be a certain threshold as to how much seagrass you need to protect those carbon stocks. But then, of course, under high grazing, you might not have as much production and productivity to add more and new carbon. And I think distinguishing this carbon stocks that are already in place versus carbon burial that might or might not take place in the future and currently is very important. And with this project, we focused on carbon stocks. So there the question is, what seagrass meadow is important to protect in order for these already sequestered carbon stocks not to be lost to the atmosphere? But we don't say anything about which seagrass meadows will in the future take out a lot of carbon of the water and the atmosphere. Right? This is a different questions where you would have to look at the burial rates. And we did not do much work with burial rates in this project. So potentially those are different types of meadows that you would want to work with to protect existing stocks versus maximize future carbon burial. Come back to your herbivory question though. We just finished a project on Bermuda, where some of you know that there has been a catastrophic decline in seagrass that was linked to excessive herbivory. And it does look like over the time period of seagrass loss of 15 years or so, there has been a significant decline in organic carbon in the sediments across the platform. So let's see, that's work that is currently in review.
We have a question in the chat from Rulio. Would you like to ask it yourself, or I can also read the question from the chat?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
All right. Absolute great presentation, and I want to just also start by saying, you know, we were able to participate in this following, I think, seeing an initial presentation in St. Kitts at the AMLC meeting there. So really good initiative, and we're very much appreciative of it. So just want to express, you know, thank you to the team for the great work that has been done. My question really relates to next steps, really understanding what countries can do with this data and how do we take it forward. While the surveys were great, it was limited sites. And what we really want to know is, you know, how do we relate this to seagrass management, or identifying if we need to look at things like restoration, or incorporating this into things like your spatial management of marine managed areas. understanding carbon stocks? Really, what are the next steps that you would recommend, or you guys planning to maybe create like a roadmap of, you know, if you participate in this project, this is what you have, but this is what you go to, because this is work that we haven't done before, but it is something that we're very interested in. And given that seagrass are one of the systems that seem to be relatively currently unaffected by, you know, rising sea temperatures, etc. It's important to ensure that we are understanding how, you know, what's impacting these systems and how do we ensure we're protecting them. So what would be, you know, the recommendation towards next steps as it relates to that?
Yeah, thank you very much. And also, of course, thank you very much for participating in the project. It's been great. Yeah, we hope that this project was an initial step in many countries, and where there has not been any data before. So in terms of managing ecosystems and building them into policy frameworks on a national level, if you don't have any data on seagrass carbon, but you're interested in using seagrasses in your nationally determined contributions, for example, or in these policy frameworks, you might end up having to use global averages, or those conservative estimates that are laid out in IPCC guidelines and so on. But we know that, or I hope I have shown that the Caribbean seagrass carbon stocks are larger than those global averages, and we can expect more. But for that, we need some sort of local data. And I think this project might have helped in starting that part, when now you have a couple of, or maybe more, data points about carbon stocks specifically in your region and in your areas that you want to manage. Now, in order to fully implement or fully bring in the blue carbon aspect of the seagrasses into policy frameworks, additional sampling would be needed in most places. And this project, at this point, at least for this part, is now concluded. There's the mapping aspect that is our partners from Nature Conservancy are still working on. And we are working on how this network can do the next steps. One of them, hopefully, would be getting at burial rates and so on, to cover that aspect in addition to just the stocks. But yeah, on a local level, or for specific partners, yeah, this is really just the first step. And for getting it into management plans, protocols can be followed, but I think a little bit more work might be needed. Does that answer your question, Julia?
It gives some direction. It definitely is the next step, and I'm glad you touched on like things like the NDCs, because this is exactly where this kind of information becomes very useful. Again, the global the accuracy of the global definitions don't always reflect what's happening, and I think that's one of the aspects that we'll be looking at. But we also want to, you know, use information like this to better understand, are there areas that we need to prioritize for restoration? Are there areas that we need to, while yes, you should encourage more use, but there's some areas that you don't have more use, and maybe, hey, if you have this type of seagrass with, you know, higher canopy, you might want to emphasize protection. So it's that kind of aspect. And I think maybe some further conversations will happen in terms of, you know, initiatives going forward. But we're one of those places that didn't really have any data besides basic biodiversity information on our seagrass beds. So it's very, you know, very interesting for us to get a little bit deeper snapshot of what's going on, and we look forward to other initiatives in the future.
We have another question from Maru. Would you like to ask it yourself?
Yeah, I can ask. I was just wondering if you have any idea on how long it might take for carbon stocks to recover after a disturbance event, or if they can recover at all, if that would be possible.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question, of course. I touched on this a little bit with this project and this data set. We are not looking at the rates of carbon accumulation and burial, but this is what you would have to look at. There are certainly seagrass meadows that have a lot of carbon stocks that do not currently bury much more or accumulate more carbon. And in those cases, if they are disturbed and the carbon stocks are lost, you might not be able to get them back. That's why it's so important to protect seagrass meadows that have large carbon stocks, because it's a lot of this accumulation, is really slow. It takes place over thousands of years. But the loss of carbon can be pretty rapid. And then in order to get those large stocks back, you would again look at timescales of thousands of years, and we don't have that much time, right? That said, there are certainly meadows that are pretty rapidly accumulating carbon, and for those it might be a little bit easier to build up stocks when they're lost. But yeah, I cannot really talk to that much because yeah, we did not measure those rates.
Yeah, I guess it's really hard to assess. But thank you so much. Nice talk.
Thanks. Thank you.
We have another question from Mauricio. Mauricio, would you like to ask it directly, or I can ask it for you? Oh, no microphone. Okay, so the question is, he says, thank you for the great presentation. With the recent hurricanes passing through, it would be possible to tell which seagrass meadows have been damaged. Can you tell how much organic carbon has been released after something like a hurricane? And if so, how many years of the stored carbon have been released?
Yeah, those are great questions. Short answer is I can't really say anything about it, but those would be good to answer. We do, our lab does research on hurricane impacts in seagrass meadows, and it's incredibly difficult because it's so not uniform, the impacts of a hurricane. For example, we had Hurricane Ian pass by one of our long-term seagrass monitoring areas in the dry Tortugas. And it's a very small little area of a few keys. And out of our 18 seagrass monitoring sites that are within a couple of kilometers or so, 30% have been completely uprooted and sediment has been mixed, and we would expect carbon stocks to be decimated there. But then you just go a little bit over to another meadow that is perfectly fine and intact. And to a degree, seagrass meadows have been evolving with hurricanes being there as a part of the system. Yeah, but again, if degradation happened and stocks are lost, it takes a long time to recover. That's, I think, generally the case. But to pin down the effect of hurricanes is really, really hard, and you have to go meadow by meadow. And I don't think it's well understood how impacts differ between different meadows. So it's hard to make predictions there. But it's a great question. Thank you.
All right, we have a few minutes left. Maybe we can have one last question if there's any outstanding ones. Otherwise, we will send a follow-up email through the mailing list. So if you think of anything later, there'll be contact information for you to find answers.
I can ask, it's not really related to these results because if I understood correctly, they were all like field measurements, but I heard that you had the background with satellite imagery and like remote sensing, and I wanted to ask what are your insights on that? Do you think, well, I know it's a pretty challenging, especially with seagrass, so I wanted to know what's your perspective?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think that's one of the big challenges that the global seagrass research community has at the moment, because if we are taking the best estimates and the best state of knowledge out there at the moment, the total area of seagrass in the world is so little understood. It might be 170,000 square kilometers or 300,000, and it's such a big difference. It makes it really hard to understand the role of seagrasses in the global carbon cycle, or the global significance of it all, because we just don't know how much there is or not. It's so hard because seagrasses are underwater, right? And so if we want to look from space underwater, we need the good conditions. Specifically for the Caribbean, our colleagues at the Nature Conservancy did a really great job creating seagrass maps for the insular Caribbean, because you have clear waters, and it is possible to get good imagery, and they produced awesome maps. But for the continental Caribbean, where you have a lot of runoff from rivers and turbid waters a lot of the time, it's really, really challenging. And in that regard, remote sensing is really limited there. But I think there are some really cool initiatives underway that make use of underwater video and annotation or identification of seagrasses from video using AI. There are some cool new sensors coming up. Satellites are improving, the sensors on satellites are improving. And I think also with drones, we have now the chance to really go out and get good imagery at the exact time when maybe conditions are good enough, like when it's not super turbid, when we have clear waters, opportunistically get images. And I think we are just banking at the moment on those technological advances to allow us to get more data cheaper, to eventually, get a better idea of where seagrasses are globally. But it's yeah, it's a little tricky that we're not there yet. I wish we had better ideas. Thanks for the question.
Okay, so I think maybe we'll wrap it up here. I really want to thank everybody for joining us. We had a lot of participants joining us online, and I want to remind everybody that we did record the webinar and we'll be posting it on the YouTube channel, the TRN YouTube channel. So you can certainly see it as many times after. And I really want to thank Johannes for being so open and giving us this talk. I think it was really, really interesting. And I think we're all just like waiting to get all this information published and available so that we can start using it for all different kinds of purposes. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Okay. Bye.